Good morning, and thank you for joining our Future Forward episode today. We are focusing on conservation in Riverside County. We will get started shortly. Stay tuned for the next 2 minutes or so, and we'll get started with the episode. Thank you.
COVID-19 has been a catalyst for ideas, for innovation.
Our employers have to be flexible.
How do we build wealth at the individual level in communities that did not have that previously?
Every city in the world will need to get more sustainable.
Innovators, entrepreneurs aren't just born, they're cultivated.
Building fair and inclusive economies is a complicated process, and we will need to be vigilant as we move forward.
Good morning. My name is Elisa Laurel, Program Manager for the Western Riverside Council of Governments, otherwise known as WRCOG, and welcome to the 11th episode of the series. Now, for any viewers that are new out there, here at WRCOG, we serve as a regional agency that focuses on helping many of our cities and jurisdictions in the Western Riverside County subregion in the areas of transportation, planning, energy, environment, and today's special topic, which is conservation. Now, before we jump into the episode, I want to thank our in-kind sponsor, the Inland Empire Regional Chamber of Commerce, for supporting this series. So big shout out and thank you to the Inland Empire Regional Chamber of Commerce. And as a friendly reminder, we will be taking questions at the end of the panel discussion, but you can also always get a head start by submitting your questions simply by scanning the QR code that appears in the corner of the screen. And you can use your cell to go ahead and scan that QR code, or you can go to slido.com, that's spelled SLIDO.com, and type that into your browser and type in the event code forward and the number 11. There should also be directions that appear in the corner of the screen. And again, that event code is forward, FORWARD, and the number 11. Additionally, because this is a YouTube link, you have the luxury of pausing and going back if you feel like you missed any information. Also, please be sure to subscribe right down below and hit that like button. So as I mentioned, today's focus will be on conservation, and we will be touching on past efforts of conservation in Riverside County, habitat conservation plans, how science has influenced management practices, and of course, what's next for conservation. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our in-house conservation expert, Princess Hester. Now, Princess, take it away.
Thank you, Elisa, and thank you everyone so much for joining us. I'm Princess Hester, Director of Administration for the Western Riverside Council of Governments. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the Riverside County Habitat Conservation Agency. The RCHCA is a joint powers authority consisting of 10 cities and the County of Riverside. This agency is responsible for managing conserved lands for the endangered Stevens kangaroo rat. Through the years, the RCHCA has made great achievements to recover SKR, and we are extremely proud of our accomplishments. We would be remiss, however, if we don't recognize the original architects of the RCHCA. They had the vision and tenacity to establish this agency on a solid foundation of conservation excellence. and provided the platform to allow those like myself and Brian Shomo, who have come after, to grow this agency to become a leader in the field of conservation. The RCHCA continually works to achieve the objectives with a future forward mission. And so it's only befitting that we're here doing a future forward series today. We've done things such as created the region's first ever public access plan on conserved lands. We've established a range-wide management and monitoring plan. We've implemented adaptive management techniques, and our support of the community through our education and volunteerism is extremely popular. And now we are awaiting the United States Fish and Wildlife's final rule to reclassify SKR, downlisting it from endangered to threatened. This is a great accomplishment for our region. And at this pivotal juncture, we'd like to commemorate May as Conservation Appreciation Month. Today, we will discuss the past, present, and future of conservation in Riverside County. We have an illustrious panel of experts to share their insight and experience with you. Please introduce yourself, and I will start now with Dr. Edie Allen.
Hi, it's my pleasure to join your 25th anniversary celebration. I am a professor emeritus and cooperative extension specialist at the University of California, Riverside. I joined UCR in 1993, and shortly thereafter, I became involved in conservation issues and conservation research in Riverside County. So even before the RCHCA was initiated, I started my research projects. And I've been active through the Department of Botany and Plant Sciences and the Center for Conservation Biology at UCR.
Thank you, Dr. Allen, and it's just been a pleasure. We've worked with you through the RCHCA for many years, and we really appreciate your commitment to conservation efforts here in Riverside County. Next, we have Tricia Campbell.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me. So I'm Tricia Campbell. I am the reserve manager for the reserve system for the Western Riverside County Multiple Species Habitat Conservation Plan. I work at the RCA, the Regional Conservation Authority, and have been there for about 2 years. Prior to that, I was a consultant and have been working in Western Riverside County for about 25 years. And I'm really happy to be here and share in what you have about conservation, past, present, and future.
Thank you so much, Tricia. And then for all of you who know that we constantly get confused between RCHCA and RCA. Well, guess what? You have us both together here today. And so we're going to work together to kind of tell you some of the differences between our agency. And next we have Dr. Wayne Spencer.
Hi, I'm Wayne Spencer. I'm the chief scientist with the Conservation Biology Institute, which is a nonprofit research and planning institute that works on conservation of biological diversity. I specialize in rare mammals, and I've been working with kangaroo rats doing research for over 40 years now, which is pretty amazing. And with Stevens kangaroo rat, the endangered species, for over 30 years. So it's been really satisfying this late in my career to be able to team with RCHCA and all the others to really pull together all the research and understanding of the species into one comprehensive range-wide plan. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. And you know, it's funny is because it's almost, you could say we've come full circle. Started with the RCHCA and the Habitat Conservation Plan when we didn't know a lot about the Stevens kangaroo rat, and now here we are working to implement range-wide management and management practices throughout the regions. It's just a pleasure to be able to continue to work with you. So welcome. And last but not least, I'd like to have our illustrious Director of County Habitat Conservation Agency, Mr. Brian Shomo.
Thank you, Princess, and it is a pleasure to be here today. I am the director of the RCHCA, and my background includes about 20 years of T&E species management, land management for government agencies. I started off my career as an ecologist with the Department of Defense. up in the high desert at Fort Irwin in the National Training Center, and came down to the RCHCA about 15 years ago as a natural resources manager, charged with trying to get some of our land back to a condition to support and help increase populations of SKR. And so just recently, we've been, very successful in creating some habitat conditions and in moving forward with a range-wide recovery plan and helpful to downlist a species. And so continuing going forward, we hope to increase that effort and eventually recover the species. So.
Thank you. And thanks again, all of you, for taking the time to be here. This is a great time for the RCHCA. Like we said, we're celebrating our 25th anniversary, and we're proclaiming May as Conservation Appreciation Month. And it's a great opportunity to, take a look backwards to see what brought us to this juncture. What were some of the great things that we've been able to accomplish to get us to this particular pivotal moment? And we know that going forward, we need to review what the future of conservation looks like for us in Riverside County, because we'll be all working together to recover not just the Stevens kangaroo rat, but also to manage those other threatened and endangered species that we have here in our area. And so first, I'd like to take the conversation to Dr. Allen. Dr. Allen, can you tell us a little bit more about your experience and your connection with the RCHCA?
Yes, most of my experience has been doing actual on-the-ground research at the various reserves and getting my students involved in that. There have been various sources of funding that could support graduate students. And so over the last 25 years, we've managed to accomplish quite a bit and provide management-oriented research to the county. And I can tell you a little bit about some of the different projects that we have been on. One of the biggest problems that I discovered when I came to Riverside in 1993 was the air pollution, and I learned that there was a link between air pollution and invasive species and fire. The air pollution includes a lot of nitrogen oxides. This is what comes out of our automobile tailpipes and other internal combustion engines. And these nitrogen oxides are deposited to the ground as nitrogen fertilizer that plants take up. And the invasive species, especially the annual grasses from the Mediterranean that have been in California for the last 200 plus years, are really good at taking up this nitrogen, and they become very productive, and they crowd out the native wildflowers. And because they are so productive, they also tend to cause more wildfires, more frequent and larger wildfires. And in the course of doing this, we have a lot of vegetation type conversion from coastal sage scrub, and even in some cases from chaparral to exotic annual grassland. And then you have this grass fire cycle. And I'm actually a restoration ecologist. When I came to Riverside, I had the idea that I was going to restore these invaded annual grasslands, and I realized that I could not solve the restoration problem until we solved the air pollution problem. So with collaboration from various reserve managers throughout the county, I started setting up research plots, collecting air quality data, collecting soil nitrogen data. I worked with my colleagues at the Forest Service Fire Lab and my graduate students. And what we learned was that we actually have a threshold of nitrogen deposition above which we will get conversion to exotic annual grassland, and below which we can conserve the native wildflowers and the native shrublands. That number 11 kilograms per hectare per year is about half of the maximum nitrogen that comes down, around 20 kilograms per hectare per year. And both of those are still way above background levels, which is 2 kilograms. But we now have a number that we can use to go to the regulatory agencies and say, okay, this is what we need to do in order to clean up the air. And we've been working with the environmental protection agencies and with the California state agencies. And gradually, we have had a great deal of success in cleaning up the air in California. And of course, we all read the newspapers. We know that there's still more work to be done, but we know now what our goals are. The other thing that I have been doing then is I've been working a lot on invasive plants. Riverside County has been very proactive about controlling certain invasive plants. Like there's been a great program in controlling arundo, or giant reed, in the Santa Ana River Basin. And that's allowing native plants to recolonize, and the willows and cottonwoods, and also the native birds and animals that live in the river basin. Exotic annual grasses, everyone is fighting them all the time. I'll talk in a few minutes more about what we've been doing there. We do have some new invasive species coming in. One of them that is of great concern is called stinknet. It's actually a beautiful yellow flower in the sunflower family, and everybody thinks it looks beautiful across the landscape, but it is also replacing the native wildflowers, and it's a huge problem for SKR. My colleague Laura Lee Larios, our new restoration ecologist in my department, who was hired after I retired, has been doing feeding trials, and she's learned that SKR simply do not prefer consuming the seeds of this invasive stinknet. I've also been doing restoration of wildlands at the various reserve with collaboration of reserve managers. Brian Shomo, of course, has been one of those managers. And over the years, we've been doing trials to control exotics. They include grazing trials, herbicide trials, fire, reseeding. And we found that any one of these methods works in different areas. It's going to depend upon the needs of the land manager there, the particular problems. If there are restrictions against fire, then we try another method. But we have been able to get some good successes in restoring native species. Again, we do have to control the air pollution in order to maintain the composition of those restored shrublands.
Yes.
Another issue then, the fourth issue I'd like to talk about is carbon sequestration. We know that our conservation lands are sequestering carbon. In California, we have the AB 32 bill, the for carbon sequestration mitigation fund. And it's only paid right now for forest lands, but we know that wildlands that are in shrublands and grasslands also sequester carbon. Right now, we don't know how much, because 3/4 of the carbon is actually below the ground. And going forward, one of the things that we really need to understand is how much land do we need to set aside to improve carbon sequestration.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And you touched on a lot of great points. I know definitely RCHCA, our agency, as well as Trisha's agency, the Regional Conservation Authority, we're all working to combat these invasive weed species that are taking over our areas. And one of the things why it's so important, and I think the public can really relate to it, is that some of the super bloom activity that we had in 2018 is actually what we really like to see in more pristine habitat for SKR, actually help to foster some of those blooms of our native forests here. And so we have definitely benefited from your students and your researchers to assist us in some of our research activities there. And we know that research is an essential component to develop principles for adaptive management practices, not just for SKR, but for the ecosystem overall. And those are the things that are going to be affecting areas throughout, not just Western Riverside County, but throughout the range. And those are projects that we are actually able to use to influence other information in the science community overall. And so just switching a little bit of the conversation to technology. Technology is an ever-changing factor. And I know when we get to hear from Dr. Spencer, he'll talk about some of this and how it's benefiting us as well. But in the last 25 years, we've seen massive changes in remote sensing of landscape, in environmental sensors to measure changes in physical variables, and also in DNA sequencing that has promoted disciplines of conservation and environmental genomics. So has technology made it easy for you, Dr. Allen, to develop and implement your theory, or more complicated in your experience? And if you could tell us a little bit about how that's benefited us.
Oh, I think it's definitely made our understanding of conservation issues much easier to develop. Google Earth, for instance, which is remote sensing satellite imagery that's available online, was finally available online in 2005, and that meant that everyone, land managers who weren't trained in remote sensing, and even scientists like myself who weren't trained in remote sensing, could all of a sudden access Google Earth and get a much better handle on changes in the landscape. It was using Google Earth that we were able to develop our critical load threshold of nitrogen deposition by examining which landscape areas had type converted from shrubland to grassland. You can see that on Google Earth. Mm-hmm. We've also been starting to use drone technology. Drone technology has really just grown in the past 10 years. It's possible now for managers to detect rare species, rare plants that grow up on steep slopes that are inaccessible, that just grow in landscapes where there is no road access. Can now be detected by using drone technology. The environmental sensors have gotten smaller and smaller. We can measure carbon sequestration in the soil by putting small carbon dioxide sensors in the soil. We can measure carbon fluxes in the atmosphere with CO2 sensors. And then the DNA sequencing has made such a difference. For instance, the Human Genome Project, which was finally published in 2001, for the cost of $1 billion, research organizations were able to sequence the human genome. Nowadays, we can take a sample of a few cells of an organism and submit them to a sequencer, and for a few dollars, we can get the sequence of that organism, and that means that we can detect for an animal, from animal feces, for plant material, from residual, even decaying plant material, whether the organism that we're looking for is there. And then along with all of that, we've developed data management. We have very much improved data management, eco-informatics and bioinformatics, and of course, huge supercomputers to manage that, and a whole new discipline of bioinformatics has developed around that we teach as a course at our university.
Definitely, it's definitely come a long way, and we are looking forward to continuing to work with your research students, your graduates, your undergrads and postdocs. Some of them even become natural resources managers, and that's pretty awesome. And so just looking forward ahead, you know, you've been so such a proponent for supporting positive research here in our region. What piece of information would you be able to provide for us as we move forward to try to coordinate some of these efforts throughout the range of SKR? If there's just a little tidbit of information you could help us to look forward, it would be greatly appreciated.
Well, regional conservation obviously is very important. The Center for Conservation Biology used to do approximately a biannual conservation symposium, and we invited conservation managers from across the region, all counties, even down into Mexico. And we talked about some of these issues and realized that, of course, many managers have the same species across the regions. The sensitive and listed species that are being managed don't recognize political boundaries, and sharing data across habitat conservation plans is critical. Plants and animals are also changing their boundaries in response to climate change. And we've already seen that a number of species like the Kino checker spot butterfly and the California gnatcatcher are moving either up in elevation or northward to find their climate envelope. As the climate in the valley gets hotter and drier, they're finding a more comfortable climate. And as they move, we need to be able to track them. And sometimes they might move out of their habitat conservation plans, and we'll need to be in touch with our neighboring plans in order to maintain those populations.
Definitely. Thank you so much. And that's a great lead in because we all recognize that coordinated conservation efforts are really what's going to be needed in order for all of our habitat conservation plans to be successful. And so with that being said, definitely would love to have the conversation with you, Tricia. I think that's a great lead in. You know, we're almost sister agencies because we share jurisdictional boundaries for the most part as it relates to our species. You know, we manage for Stevens kangaroo rat and have been doing that since the 1990s. And you manage all of the other threatened and endangered species throughout Riverside County. And so it's going to be great for us to be able to coordinate and work together in the future. So can you tell us a little bit about the RCA, the MSHCP, which is the Multi-Species Habitat Conservation Plan, and what are some of the similarities and differences between the RCHCA and the RCA?
Well, it's going to be hard to follow, Dr. Allen, but this is going to be much more boring than that. So the RCA implements the Western Riverside County Multiple Species Habitat Conservation Plan, and it's a 1.2 million acre plan area. So like the RCHCA, we are a joint powers authority that was created by the member agencies, which are 18 cities in the county of Riverside. And then we also have other permittees of our plan that have signed up to implement the plan, be consistent with the plan with their projects. And those are RCTC, Caltrans, Riverside County Flood Control, County Waste Management, etc. So there's a number of entities that have signed up to fulfill the MSHCP's requirements. And we cover 146 species. We're still in the phase of reserve assembly, unlike the SKRHCP, which has completed its reserve for quite some time. Both agencies were created through a habitat conservation plan, which is directly related to the Federal Endangered Species Act. So both entities and their plans were associated with the idea of balancing development with conservation, whether it's a single species or multiple species. Without development feeding through mitigation fees or what have you, you don't have the HCP. And so that's kind of a delicate balance and sometimes is difficult. The SKRHCP was very early on, one of the first HCPs in Southern California, has been incredibly successful. The Western Riverside County MSHCP came on board in 2004. Because of the number of species covered, they were very smart, the people who put together the plan. They said, hey, we don't want to just cover listed species, but we want to think ahead, and we want to be able to cover species that may in the future get listed, and also species that may never get listed, but would trigger concerns through the California Environmental Quality Act, for example. And so we've got a tall order, certainly, but boy, agencies like RCHCA, county parks, state parks, BLM, a whole host of folks are partner agencies that help us fulfill and implement the plan. One of the very confusing parts about the SKRHCP and the MSHCP is that the SKRHCP, the plan area, occurs within our plan area. And so what the heck is going on there? So the SKRHCP, if you are an entity that's, a developer who's processing your project through one of the permittees of the SKRHCP, and you're in that plan boundary, you're allowed impacts or take of that species through the SKRHCP. If you are outside of the SKRHCP, but within the Western Riverside County plan area, that difference, you receive take coverage of Stevens kangaroo rat in that area and not the SKRHCP. So I'm sure by now I've put you to sleep. It's something that comes up all the time. And so one of my jobs is I do project compliance as well as oversee reserve assembly, but we do have county parks and this Anna Watershed Association that performs our management, land management, and monitoring. And so what's your next question? Any other follow-up?
That was a really good explanation as it relates to both of the habitat conservation plans. And you're right, we get those questions all the time. There are several times when folks will call us and ask us, questions in regards to their criteria cell and things like that. And definitely, so that was really good, great explanation in regards to the plan. And Brian, did you have something to add?
To Tricia's point, it's like the pendulum started off on the left side with the SKR single species focus, in the early 90s. And then they threw everything at the kitchen sink that could possibly be listed or potentially listed in 146 species. You've never seen anywhere else in the time period between there that most HCPs are about 20 some species. It's very difficult to manage all those species, 146, and you don't really want to just manage for one species. So, it's interesting from our perspectives, from the HCP perspectives, and how you manage those, and that's a whole nother conversation maybe too, but it makes it challenging on both parts going forward. But you can add up all the other HCPs in all the county, the CV MSHCP, the El Sobrante MSHCP, the Lake Matthews MSHCP, there's others, and you still probably would get close to the amount that's covered under the Western Riverside MSHCP. So it's a challenging thing for the RCA to do. and they're focused on acquisition right now. But something going forward, when all this land is actually acquired, is how do you manage it, and what's the funding available to manage those open spaces in a manner that assists in the recovery of all those T&E species that development has impacted in Western Riverside County. And I don't know if that's a conversation that we can have here or what, but it would be interesting going forward to ask some of these questions and get all these inputs from all these experts here.
Definitely. And, you know, those are ongoing conversations that we'll continue to have. I know we know that the MSHCP is the largest multi-species plan in the United States. And so that's definitely some you know, answers that we could look forward to working together, especially as we work on this range-wide management and monitoring plan, because we see that as not just being something that covers SKR, see that as that being something that can be the sort of launching point for having those discussions for other species throughout this range. Because like Dr. Allen alluded to the fact that species don't recognize jurisdictional boundaries. And if they decide to hop across the road, you know, or to fly in another area, they're not going to put up caution signs that says, oh no, I'm not supposed to be here, especially as agencies work to manage the habitat holistically, as the RCHCA has done and as the RCA will begin to do once their assembly is complete. And so when you create habitat, you're creating habitat that's a benefit of the ecosystem and not just of a particular species. And so those will be questions, you know, that we'll have to start to have deeper conversations on in the future. And so you know, definitely something we can talk about. But one of the things I did want to bring up, Tricia, is we're actually, the RCHCA and the RCA, we're sort of both on the cusp of something fantastic happening from a federal level. And Congressman Ken Calvert of the U.S. House of Representatives presented that bill, H.R. 972, to create the Western Riverside County Wildlife Refuge, which would consolidate a patchwork of preserved lands under the Western Riverside MSHCP. And when that happened and that notice came out in the newspaper, we had folks calling us to ask us, you know, how is that going to affect you? And does this have an impact on the RCHCA? And so one of the questions that we wanted to know is, how will this wildlife corridor assist the RCA in meeting their goals of acquisition, since you are in the assembly phase right now for your agency? And then will it potentially reduce some of the regulatory requirements on development projects?
No, these are great questions. And it's exciting that there's the potential of a federal wildlife refuge coming in. Something I did not understand, I'm early, you know, new to this program, is that that was contemplated throughout the MSHCP creation, is that the federal government would, let me back up a little, both there's a local, state, and federal funding and acquisition contribution. So the local level is the RCA and the member agencies, the permittees, and we have a higher acreage that we need to acquire for the reserve. But the state and the federal governments also signed up for a portion of providing to the reserve assembly. And so this federal wildlife refuge would be an opportunity for the federal government to meet its acquisition, what they signed up for. And so it's a wonderful opportunity. The plan is that it would perhaps, you know, it hasn't settled in on any particular area, but it would be within the Western Riverside County Plan area, and that it would hopefully, if nothing else, link up existing reserve lands, but also provide core, larger scale conservation. So like in a core area, a chunk of land. And so that all needs to be worked out. And it's really something that's worked out, you know, once there's funding available and approval, it's through U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that they determine through their refuge office what that would look like, how they would manage it, but they would also be managing those lands. And so it's a really exciting time. I know that there's also something similar being asked of in the desert, which is very specific to corridor movement, animal movement. So it's definitely going to help us meet there's roughly a 90,000 acre need still to complete the reserve. And the sooner that we can complete the reserve, whether it's through a wildlife refuge, whether it's through funding, what have you, that part, once the reserve is completed, then that part of the MSHCP compliance goes away. That would make a lot of people happy. It would make me ecstatic, because that is one of the rubs that occurs is, you know, my property is in a criteria cell. My gosh, what do I have to do? And understandably. So that would also, you know, it gets us closer. So it wouldn't immediately change the regulatory level or the requirements, but it would help meet that reserve assembly sooner. The other part is that once we meet the reserve assembly, and it's not just an acreage thing, it actually has, there's very specific things in certain places that have to happen. And that is how the coverage of the 146 species is supposed to occur. Well, there's some species that still have survey areas, still have certain conservation or mitigation requirements because they're not adequately conserved yet. So when we meet that reserve assembly and it's done properly, we should be able to release those survey requirements. Mitigation fees will still be required, but some of the not yet adequately conserved species should be adequately conserved once the reserve is assembled. And that's why it's really important that when projects come in, there are certain locations you can't make up that anywhere else. This was planned and described for conservation. That doesn't occur anywhere else, or those properties are the linkage, you know, a constrained linkage. So it definitely helps in a big way, and it's exciting.
Thank you, Tricia. Thank you. And so now I'd like to pivot a little to Dr. Wayne Spencer. One of the things we've talked about is our technology and advancements as far as technology is concerned. And you've definitely been a pioneer in that area, particularly with Conservation Biology Institute, with the RCHCA. And I'd just like to get your input a little bit more on this habitat suitability model. Can you tell us just a little bit about this model and how it will assist in SKR recovery efforts?
Yeah, thank you, Princess. Like I said earlier, I've been working with the species for 30 years now, and it's trying to understand how well the species is doing overall has been extremely difficult, because it's very difficult to accurately map where the species occurs or is likely to occur and how habitat quality varies over time. And technological fix was required. This is because the maps that we traditionally use for understanding wildlife habitat relationships tend to be fairly static human creations. Like vegetation maps might just show grassland versus chaparral or coastal sage or oak woodland. So from a human perspective, what is mapped as grassland, if you hand it over to a kangaroo rat, it's a huge diversity of conditions. We may just see sort of open habitat without trees and shrubs, but they see everything from very dense invasive annual grasses, like Dr. Allen talked about, that build up deep thatch that a little kangaroo can't even hop through, to the conditions that they actually evolved with before the invasives came in, were much more open ground with a lot of wildflowers. And Dr. Allen's work backs this up. A great diversity of annual wildflowers that produce seed during the spring and summer that the kangaroo rats eat, and then they dry up and leave a lot of bare ground, and the kangaroo rats can hop around and bathe in the sand and make their burrows and make their seed caches. So it's actually a very wide array of conditions that we humans tend to kind of not perceive. So habitat mapping was difficult, and the breakthrough was to recognize that there is now free satellite imagery from all these various programs that are tracking how Earth is doing, how things are changing with climate change and so on. And the satellite imagery can detect things that we humans can't. We see the colors of the rainbow, and these satellites can take pictures that see into infrared, you know, the color of heat. or into ultraviolet, things that hummingbirds and bees can see, but we humans can't. And if you pick those kind of frequencies in this radio bandwidth or color bandwidth, it shows things that we don't see, but that are important to species like kangaroo rats. And so using the satellite imagery and putting it, variables derived from it, variables that reflect like how dry is the vegetation, how moist is the vegetation, how much bare ground is there, how coarse is the soil. Those things important to kangaroo rats can be detected by these satellite images. And therefore the habitat map is not only more nuanced and accurate at predicting what's important to them, but since the satellite imagery is regularly updated, you could get seasonal patterns or annual changes due to, for example, Brian's management. He may oversee some prescribed fire or a grazing or some other treatment. You can then see in the following year or the following season, how did that affect habitat? And if we measure on the ground how the species responds to that, then we have a correlation between this satellite-based habitat model and how the species is actually doing on the ground that can see the entire range at once. Up till now, we've been, we have a lot of information on this species, but it's very scattered, very fragmented. Different agencies keeping different databases, doing management, trying to track changes on their preserves. But there's been no central way of pulling that all together into a comprehensive picture. So that's what this method has allowed, a more accurate depiction of habitat quality that can be updated over time and used by all the managers to understand their piece of the puzzle.
Very helpful. And I'd like to bring Brian Shomo in on the conversation at this juncture. Brian, how can you use this habitat suitability information to influence some of your recovery efforts on the landscape?
Well, as Wayne said, I mean, it really helps focus your management, where you want to put your resources at any given time. It'll be updated annually. So you can, any land manager can reference this and kind of focus their management or monitoring on those particular areas that are already good habitat, as well as areas that are bad habitat, and really help with their annual work plan development. And going forward, we'll have a much more sense of the effectiveness of our management actions, whether that's grazing, burning, or mowing. We'll have a kind of a ongoing running record using the satellite imagery and seeing how effective we are going forward.
That's really good. And so, Brian, you're going to be responsible for implementing this range-wide management and monitoring program, which is really going to take bringing together various groups with different objectives, but ultimately the same goal of species recovery. What do you see some of the advantages or some of the challenges would be with such a dynamic group?
The challenges within any dynamic group are everybody has different missions, and we have to show some empathy towards that. For instance, RCHCA, you wake up in the morning, you know what you focus on, and that's SKR. A lot of other folks have multiple species, as Tricia alluded to. She has to worry about 146 different species. So the challenge is bringing everybody together and having everybody pull their own weight, but pull in the same direction to go forward. So we can make a difference and we can move the needle on those efforts. The biggest challenges I see is, one is funding. We all need more funding for management, for monitoring purposes. A lot of the focus with these HCPs, as Tricia said, is acquisition. Nobody has figured out how to manage or monitor really on a large scale going forward. There's a minimal amount of monitoring done at this point, primarily to see if you're fulfilling the obligations of the HCPs. But as we all recognize, HCPs aren't recovery plans. There's a much more intensive effort to recover species. Our HCPs are really development plans or mitigation plans for development, but they were never intended to recover a species. Local efforts can't recover a species. They cross geopolitical lines. Regional efforts have to focus on recovering species. And going forward, I think we need to figure out a way. This recovery plan is an excellent start. We have a lot of diverse backgrounds, and we have all the big players with DOD, San Diego County, Riverside County, all focusing on the recovery efforts. Keeping that group together, moving forward, and finding a funding sources year after year is going to be a challenge. Finding one-time funding is often easy. finding ongoing year after year for a next decade or two is often very, very difficult. So hopefully this plan, we took all that into account. We tried to build on existing programs that are already in place. I think it's much more of a doable effort going forward than what has ever been conceived in the past, where everybody is kind of in their own silos, doing their own monitoring, keeping that data on their own computers, and we have no real concept of what is regionally happening with SKR populations or management. So I think this plan hopefully will be the groundwork, the blueprint going forward, and how all rare species are recovered and taking to that regional context going forward. So.
Well, thank you so much. You guys are definitely truly experts in your field. And again, I'd just like to thank you for taking the time, to share some of your experiences and your information with us today. And, we share the opinion that as far as conservation is concerned, coordinated regional effort is key if we're going to recover any species, not just SKR, but all of the species that we're working towards. Without regional coordination, fragmentation is going to continue and our overall success would be questionable. And so it will add value by reducing our duplicative efforts. It'll focus our resources. Like Brian said, we need to be able to come together to identify solid funding sources to help us all be able to move further. It'll also create a stronger coalition to reach individual agency goals, as we all know that we have different objectives that we're responsible for, depending on what our HCPs require, what our landscape requires. And so, but it creates also us having a shared ownership of the common goal, and that is species recovery. And that's what we're all looking to do here. So with that, I'd like to definitely thank you again for joining us. We hope that this information was beneficial. You can always look deeper into some more conversations as it relates to the work that the RCHCA is doing, that UCR is doing, Conservation Biology Institute, and also the Regional Conservation Authority. Please feel free to visit all of our websites for more information. And if you like, you'll have the information for each one of our panel members today. Reach out to them directly, and I'm sure that they would be available to answer your questions for you. And so with that, what we're going to do right now is lead into the question and answer section of our presentation. Thank you. Back to you, Elisa.
Thank you, Princess. Now, I just want to remind everyone, please be sure to scan the QR code that appears in the corner of the screen to submit your questions, or go to slido.com, that's spelled SLIDO.com, and enter the code FORWARD, FORWARD, and the number 11. Now, I'll be turning it over to my colleague, Rachel Singer, External Affairs Manager for WRCOG, who will be moderating today's discussion. So don't forget to submit your questions, and Rachel, turning it over to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Elisa. And as Elisa mentioned, my name is Rachel Singer. I'm the External Affairs Manager here at WRCOG, and I will be moderating the live Q&A. So if you haven't already, go ahead and log on to the slido.com application with the code FORWARD11 to participate in our live Q&A and submit questions. So to start off this time, Dr. Spencer, I'd love to be able to ask you our first question, which is from the audience, and it says, can you share about what the value is of coordinated regional conservation efforts, and do you feel that it's important?
Oh, absolutely. The thing is, no species recognizes our human boundaries, and Stevens kangaroo rat, like so many, is distributed across a wide range of jurisdictions and ownerships and boundaries, and all of those places with different rules and regulations and things. So coordinating in order to benefit the species is absolutely critical. And that sort of collaborative work we've been doing is necessary for many more species for that reason.
Mm-hmm. And then Brian, maybe do you want to add on to that from like an administrative perspective?
Yeah, so here in Western Riverside, I'll speak generally towards the SKR HCP, but we have 8 different reserves in Western Riverside dedicated to SKR conservation. Within those reserves, you have multiple owners, and there's multiple HCPs and multiple management plans, all designed to protect the SKR in their own way. And so to have a coordinated effort, so everybody is pulling their own weight, but pulling in the same direction, is necessary for recovery. Previously, 10 years ago, it was a hodgepodge of different conservation strategies, different management strategies, with everybody having a different mission. Some had to conserve kangaroo rats based on population size. Some HCPs told you to conserve just habitat without necessarily having to count or to know what the population size of SKR was. And so what the new range-wide management plan basically did was take all the available information that we currently have in protecting SKR and conserving SKR across the region, put it into one cookbook, more or less, so we have one recipe that everybody can follow. And hopefully every 5 years when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does their status review to see if the species is recovered or not, now we have a standardized data format, we have a standardized monitoring effort, we have standardized management to promote the recovery of the species. And so when everybody is pulling in that same direction, it's much easier to track the stats and trends of the species going forward. And that's the real challenge of it. And we needed to assemble a bunch of different components in order to make that standardized assessment. Again, everybody was doing it differently. Now it's a uniform method going forward. So.
Yeah, and to your point, really trying to streamline that effort to make it more clear for across agencies, across jurisdictional boundaries, as Dr. Spencer mentioned. And so that's definitely true. So another question we have coming from the audience is more geared for like public engagement, if you will. So what are some of the suggested ways for the public to get involved with conservation efforts in their own kind of sphere of influence? Tricia, do you want to start us off with that question?
Oh, absolutely. So there's many opportunities for folks to get out and get on some of the reserve lands to be the eyes and ears for us. Just like for the RCHCA, the SKR HCP reserve system, the multiple species habitat conservation reserve system, you can report issues to us. I mean, a lot of times the lands are sprawling and difficult to be everywhere at the same time. And so it's really important for folks to be the eyes and ears for us. There's also a great opportunity to have input, to collect data that can be provided. So, you know, and Brian, I think, has really been instrumental in creating public outreach programs, whether it's through the schools, and then filtering out through there. So I'd like, Brian, for you to add to that, if you might.
Yeah, so it starts at a young age. And if you have children, getting them interested in outdoors is absolutely crucial to valuing open spaces going into the future. If you never have the opportunity to get outside, it's hard to make the argument that it should be protected. And so recreational opportunities have to exist, but at the same time, we need to have volunteers, as Tricia said, to be our eyes and ears. We don't necessarily know if there's a fence break or a degraded habitat recently or an illegal dump. So all those can be reported to each of our agencies, and then we can respond to make the habitat value better, to make our communities better going forward. But in addition to that, we're also interested in knowing anecdotal information that the public can provide as far as species occurrence is concerned. There's apps such as iNaturalist that you can put a dot using your cell phone, where you've seen an animal. Say you see a turkey vulture and it had a wing tag, you can tell us a number and know where that animal was at. So we can then go out and do a more proper scientific type survey and maybe achieve some of the species objectives within these HCPs. So there's opportunities for volunteerism. There's opportunities, educational opportunities, go on interpretive hikes within our open space areas through each of our agencies. So there's plenty of opportunity for the public to get involved. It just takes an effort on your part to actually get out there and do it and take the initiative to respond to each of our agencies.
Certainly. Thank you so much for sharing. So our next question is going to be more geared towards Dr. Allen. So Dr. Allen, since some plant and animal species change habitat due to climate change, as you mentioned earlier in our discussion, how can this impact the local ecosystem?
Okay, interesting question, and it's really the big unknown of the future. We have species that are moving upslope and northward because they're trying to match their climate envelope. That means they're disappearing from their current habitat. Of course, we do hope that they can find new habitat that is suitable for them, but what happens to the existing habitat? So if it's a rare species like the keynote checker spot butterfly. Of course, we miss the opportunity of seeing it in its habitat as members of the public who like to go out and recreate in our wildlands. But the butterfly, for instance, is a pollinator. Since it's a rare pollinator now, we have to maintain the function of other pollinators in those ecosystems. And then it becomes a pollinator in a new ecosystem. The bigger problem will come in the future as we have more abundant species starting to shift northwards. I've read, for instance, in Canada that more dryland species such as ponderosa pine in British Columbia will be planted more and more northward. And that's going to shift whole ecosystems, and exactly how that affects the functioning of the ecosystem is under study.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Spencer, did you want to add to that?
Well, maybe just to make it specific to the SKR, the Stevens kangaroo rat that we're talking about, as Dr. Ellen said, it's a great unknown, but we have clues for a lot of species about how they're likely to react. And I think the good news for the Stevens kangaroo rat is based on its particular ecology and its lifestyle, it's probably not one of the biggest losers under climate change. If anything, it might be their habitat may benefit because kangaroo rats in general are sort of desert species. They're highly adapted to desert conditions. And if we have hotter, drier summers and longer droughts and that sort of thing, the Stevens kangaroo rat may actually benefit, whereas other species may be very, very sensitive to changes in weather patterns. But a huge caveat there is there will be shifts on the landscape. We know that. We don't know exactly how it'll happen with SKR, but they need to move around as things change. And so one of the important things with taking a range-wide look like we did with this conservation plan is the connectivity of the populations and the habitat is critical, so they have the chance to move. Where there's freeways and cities in between habitat patches, they cannot move through there. So that's one of the things that we're looking at really carefully with the science for the Stevens kangaroo rat, with the monitoring and research program, is as climate changes and the animals have to shift, can we accommodate that?
Definitely.
The other thing too is it has to be kind of recognized is we're buying and acquiring habitat now for species that are currently in those areas. But if the shift occurs, whether that's, as Dr. Allen said, higher in latitude or higher in elevation, we need to be aware of that and create these corridors and linkages that perhaps can accommodate that. And so, future research should concentrate on the effective use of those corridors to provide those pathways so species can migrate to suitable habitat in the future in the face of climate change. So just something that conservation biologists need to study a bit more, but the current acquisition is really taking place where they're currently residing. So it's a difficult task.
So I actually have a question coming in from our audience, I think building off of kind of this conversation. So how can more input be provided for preserving portions of constrained linkages? Like what would that look like? Brian, do you want to maybe start us off with that?
Can you repeat the question? Something constrained linkage?
Yeah, how can more input be provided for preserving portions of constrained linkages?
Well, we need to know where those linkages need to occur based on animal movements and where we anticipate they need to be in the future. In addition, I think we need to sponsor, the agencies have to sponsor research, academic research, to see the value of the connectivity to identify those corridors and what species can use those corridors. Not every corridor is suitable. For instance, a riparian corridor may be good for at least Bell's Vireo, but not good for SKR.
Yeah, Tricia, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, so the Western Riverside County MSHCP, that's where the region-wide approach, and it's 146 species that are covered. So exactly in reference to what you were talking about, Brian, there are constrained linkages. There's other proposed linkages. There's cores, and it's distributed throughout the 1.2 million acre plan area. And so those particular areas, when people want to develop in them, or we already know the areas that we need to have conserve, to acquire and protect in perpetuity. And it's for the wide range of species, and it overlays to include SKR, even in areas that perhaps were not enveloped within the SKR HCP plan area. So it speaks again to region-wide opportunities, region-wide really careful thinking, and all that was done, 20 years ago in preparation for the MSHCP. But the SKR HCP is an example of really a plan that was so successful early on. And then the MSHCP came on and just sort of blew it up even farther to provide those linkages. And so as climate change occurs, it's integral to be able to reach the reserve build out that we have to ensure that connectivity.
Yeah, I hear that connectivity being one of like the cornerstones of that success of showing conservation, like proof points, if you will. But in the name of just being mindful of everyone's time, I'm going to actually have to close out our live Q&A. But thank you guys so much for tuning in today to today's episode, and thank you to our featured speakers, our esteemed speakers, for participating. And I'm going to turn it back over to you, Elisa.
Well, thank you, Rachel. And now before we sign off, while we won't be having a Future Forward episode in June, we will be hosting a special virtual celebration that was typically hosted in person. That is our annual General Assembly. We will be taking a bit of a virtual pivot this year, and while many things might look a little bit different, the spirit of the event still remains the same. We will be celebrating the accomplishments of the subregion over the past year and honoring our communities and members that have navigated through the COVID-19 pandemic and have come out stronger than ever, which actually goes in line with this year's special theme, that's one of resilience. This will be the 30th annual General Assembly, and in alignment with our theme of resilience, I'm happy to announce our special guest speaker for the virtual event. He is someone that embodies the resilient spirit, and that is Mr. Damon John. He is the founder and CEO of FUBU, a revolutionary clothing brand that took the nation by storm in the 90s and continues to do so today. Nowadays, Damon John also continues to work as an entrepreneur and an investor through ABC's ultra popular show, Shark Tank. You may have heard of it. But he is someone we're excited to have join us for this year's General Assembly. So please be sure to join us on Thursday, June 24th at 4 p.m. Registration will be out soon, so keep an eye out for that. Until then, see you guys next time. Bye.